Presentation. Today we have a great presentation from our partners at P&M, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Nick Marietta.
Hey, thank you, Mary. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending this month's October peer group hosted by our members of the cybersecurity team of P&M Resources. Emily, if you could pull up our slides and we could get going on this presentation. All right, so our presentation today, Malicious or Malformed. We're going to talk about effective software analysis and incident response. If we go to the next slide, Emily. I'm going to introduce members of my team. We have Sarah Casada, who is an Information System Security Specialist, and Lewis Allen, also an Information System Security Specialist here at P&M Resources. Both of these individuals play a vital role in our incident response process and procedures throughout P&M. And they'll be talking today about and highlighting specific topics and scenarios as we get into the presentation. So the agenda today, we're going to talk about enterprise third-party cybersecurity, supply chain, trust or not to trust, malicious or malformed software, and incident response. And we're going to have a wrap up based on these three topics and any question and answers at the end. So we're going to go ahead and get into enterprise third-party risk components for cybersecurity. This is essential, obviously, to everything that we do from the vendors that we do business with to support the organizations. The first one I want to talk about is cybersecurity risks. We do have a lot of vendors, contractors, managed service providers that do perform legitimate work within our environments, our infrastructures, systems, and attackers may use these third parties as an entry point to try to get a hold of valuable assets that are valuable to an organization. Vendor services include software engineering. You may hire or employ software engineering from a third party to develop specific programming needs for applications that are utilized within the environment. Some risks also from third party include poor security practices by vendors, ensuring that their code is up to date or valid, or making sure that they're using best practices related to, or they're not using open source coding. Compromised software and hardware is one of the biggest that we see now a lot with vendors. Security vulnerabilities also related to software that we install across our environments. Security vulnerabilities need to be addressed. We need to make sure that the software that we're utilizing, if they do have any type of vulnerabilities within the environment, that they're getting remediated efficiently and effectively by these vendors. And then also counterfeit hardware. Sometimes there could be a hardware that is shipped or provided and installed internally into data centers that are not actually developed or shipped by a potential vendor that is used, or technology that is used within the environment. Operational risks include malicious actors that potentially target internal systems and services used to access your data. This can lead to partial interruptions of your computing environment up to including the inability to operate. So you look at ransomware or malware attacks where they take down systems where you may have customer data or information, and you're not able to produce, in our sense, provide electricity or power to our customers. We look at compliance risks. You have a lot of national industry specific standards and regulations that set strict cybersecurity criteria that organizations should meet. Furthermore, third parties working with these organizations also have to comply with these requirements. So non-compliance within our type of organizations, or many out there, maybe in healthcare, banking, financial, if we're not compliant within those requirements that are set forth by the federal government, state, local. It could cause substantial fines that impact the organization. Reputational risk is also one of the biggest areas of concern. If critical data and systems are compromised, this can have a severe impact to a company's reputation with partners and customers, both current and future. Regaining the trust will take a lot of time, and sometimes it may never happen, which means loss in revenue over time, and the relationships are no longer there. We go to the next slide. So when we talk about enterprise third-party cybersecurity, we look at it from a controls perspective. We like to talk about, where we at every layer. Defense in depth is probably the proper term that we're looking at to ensure that we have sufficient amount of technology controls that can detect any type of malicious act that's happening in the environment. When we look at a defense in depth strategy, we want to ensure that we have a proper approach that uses multiple layers of security for holistic protection. A layered defense helps security organizations reduce the vulnerabilities, contain threats quicker, and mitigate the risk in a much faster fashion. This basically means if you get through one area within our one layer of our security controls, the next layer will have the protective measures to contain and prevent further infiltration into the crown jewels of your environment, meaning customer data or essential data that could be damaging or critical if it was accessed or released into the public. Zero trust is another component of control. And this is a strategic initiative that helps prevent successful data breaches by eliminating the concept of trust from an organization's network architecture. You basically never trust, but always verify. So Zero Trust is designed to protect modern digital environments by leveraging network segmentation, preventing lateral movement across different systems within layer 7 and threat prevention, and simplifying granular user access control. Multi-factor authentication is another method that is quickly gaining ground. If not, there's a lot of organizations that still don't enforce this method of protection, and is used as an authentication method to make sure that there's a second factor involved when you have a combination of other authenticators to provide different factors. And the 3 authentication factors is something you know, something you have, and something you are. So for many of you that maybe utilize a VPN, you have a credential and a password that you utilize, and then maybe a soft token on a phone or some sort of a grid that you would have to answer challenge questions as the second factor to gain access to the network. Additionally, least privilege recommends that users, systems, and processes only have access to resources, network systems, and files that are absolutely necessary to perform their assigned function. So this basically means that everybody within the organization has a specific role, and they only have access to specific systems based on that role. And access isn't spread out or people aren't over provisioned to have access to systems that are not necessary to do their job. Next slide. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Sarah, and she's going to be talking about supply chain trust or not to trust within your organization.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, New Mexico Tech Council, for having us today. My name is Sarah. I am an IT security specialist with P&M Resources, and today I'm going to discuss a little bit about software supply chains, the state of them, and how that relates to incident response. Next slide. So let's talk about the current state of software supply chains. If this past year has taught us anything, it's that organizations are more vulnerable than ever to cyber attacks that involve trusted third parties such as software providers. Compromising a trusted source isn't a new tactic. The Target data breach in 2013, which impacted approximately 110 million Target credit card shoppers, was due to an HVAC vendor's login credentials being harvested through a phishing email. So phishing, and specifically phishing third parties for your org's network credentials, has long been a tactic of choice to gain unauthorized access to networks, and it still is today. So what did we learn from that? Did we learn anything from that? I hope some of us learned that some form of multi-factor authentication is a crucial step to protecting organizations from unauthorized external access. When deployed, configured, and used correctly, MFA can effectively void successful credential harvesting attempts, such as phishing and keystroke logging malware. Without that second factor of authentication, for login credentials, login credentials often prove to be useless to bad actors. And for many of us, while phishing continues to be a threat to our day-to-day operations, security teams have adapted, and we've shifted to proactive measures to reduce the risk of being impacted by this type of threat specifically. So what about software supply chains? Software supply chains can consist of open source code, off-the-shelf solutions, and some mix of in-house builds merged with the previous two. And there are various points to this chain, but ultimately the end goal is deployment and utilization in our environments. And it's impossible to avoid software supply chains, as nearly all business today is conducted using software-based solutions consisting of numerous dependencies. So now that we know a little bit about supply chains, we'll transition over to talking about software supply chain attacks specifically. Next slide, please. So it's estimated that software supply chain attacks increased 650% year over year from 2015 to 2020 per Sonatype's 2021 State of the Software Supply Chain Report. So what is a software supply chain attack? What are we talking about when we refer to a software supply chain attack? So per CISA and NIST, Defending Against Software Supply Chains Attack publication, which was released in April of 2021, a software supply chain attack occurs when a cyber threat actor infiltrates a software vendor's network. They find some way to deploy malicious code and to compromise the software before the vendor sends it to its customers. At that point, the compromised software is then distributed to customers through some sort of trusted distribution channel. And ultimately for the customer, this compromise occurs at a couple of places. Either you could potentially purchase new software that has already been compromised, or this can also occur during when updating from maintenance, updates, hot fixes. So when you're utilizing those trusted channels from your software vendors. And ultimately, all users of compromised software are ultimately impacted, and this can have widespread consequences for organizations of all types, governments, critical infrastructure, private sector software customers. We're all vulnerable to this type of attack, as we've seen recently. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the 3 commonly used tactics that are used to execute software supply chain attacks, and a little bit about why ultimately these types of attacks are so successful. So there are 3 common techniques used: hijacking updates, undermining code signing, and compromising open source code. So hijacking updates, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but any security-minded software vendor is going to provide support and maintenance for the software that they're distributing. You want that from your vendor. Everything from freeware such as Adobe Reader and Java to licensed software such as from Microsoft and Oracle. All of these vendors are providing you with regular updates to address bugs, implement new features, and yes, fix security issues. These updates are typically distributed from centralized servers to their customers. And many organizations implement these updates as they are released, which is best practice, as part of routine maintenance in your environments. If a security patch is released, you want that. Some environments, they do it within days. Some environments do it within weeks. Hopefully within a month, you're covered from your previous month's security patches, but typically there's a quick turnaround time for implementing updates in many environments. So with this technique, a threat actor can hijack the update by compromising the vendor's network, inserting malicious code into the outgoing update, or by altering the update to allow the threat actor control over the software's normal functionality. So the next tactic that is commonly used is undermining code signing. So when an attacker attempts this method, code signing is a process of digitally signing software and applications to verify the integrity and validity of said software and its authors. So you have something like a certificate authority that issues certificates that says, yes, this is my software, I'm the one who developed it, and this is the state that it's in. And it's a trusted process. Most of us use it. You know, everyone should be using it, but attackers will attempt to undermine code signing by using self-signed certificates, breaking the signing systems, or even by exploiting misconfigured accounts to gain access to certificate authorities used to sign. So they can ultimately use your own CA to sign their code before it goes out. Being able to sign code allows a malicious actor to potentially go undetected, because if you see that A, you're getting an update from someone, and B, it's signed by them, you're most likely going to trust it. So that's the next tactic that occurs. And the last one that's very common is compromising open source code. So the use of publicly accessible code libraries is standard practice in the software development world. If you are a software developer, you are not writing your code from scratch. It just doesn't occur anymore. All developers rely heavily on open source communities to provide them with code to build their software on. You know, much of the functionality needed for software developers has already been written, and it's shared to use freely. And developers visit these open source code libraries, they pull from them, they add them to their own code, and this ultimately gets inserted into our systems that ultimately end up in production. And because these are publicly accessible, open to modified, they're community driven, threat actors can attempt to alter these legitimate libraries or add their own copies of code that are similar to existing blocks, you know, in hopes of catching an unsuspecting developer pulling a library that kind of sounds like the one that they were going to use, but it's actually not a legitimate one. So with that, these are the three commonly used tactics in software supply chain attacks, and they can also be used simultaneously in a single attack. So with that being said, though, the ability to successfully pull off a software supply chain attack requires strong technical aptitude and is often a really long-term commitment. The types of individuals who are successful are often attributed to advanced persistent threat actors, or APTs. So what typically makes these successful? There are three things that make these successful: privileged access requirements, frequent communications, and trusted relationships. So privileged access requirements. The prevalence of third-party software products running with elevated system privileges increases the chance of compromised software functioning as it needs to. You know, how many times have you been asked to grant a user local admin access because the software they bought just has to run, you know, with local admin rights? And in addition to that, every user of that software, it has to run as a local admin on their workstation as well. You know, in a lot of cases, this request is made by default and it's granted without any further investigation. You know, as security professionals, we try our best not to be the department of no. So we often have to pick our battles, and the battle of local administrative rights tends to be one that we lose. So with privileged access for the software running, malicious actors may be able to leverage their software more readily and pivot across your network that way. So the next common reason why these are so successful is frequent communications. If you have software in your environment and you have some sort of maintenance contract, you do expect to get routine patching as part of that relationship. Oftentimes this is handled over the internet. They're not mailing you a USB that you insert into everyone's computers and manually update patching. Patch Tuesday for Microsoft, if you are having your users go out to internet to download those patches, that week after Patch Tuesday is a really heavy week if they're on your network trying to download patches. So most of that traffic would be considered baseline, and even large amount of traffic from these entities could go undetected because you expect to be pulling large amount of data. So you expect to be talking to them regularly. And maybe you even have vendors who come into your network to maintain that software. So this frequent communication, you know, the bilateral traffic is is something that you typically expect from a software vendor that you have allowed into your environment. So this is going to increase their chances to get into your network because they're using a legitimate channel to get there. So the last thing that makes these so successful is kind of ties these first two together, and it's our trust relationships. Privileged access requirements, frequent communications can both be summed up into a single reason that makes software supply chain attacks so successful, and what makes them so dangerous, and that is trust. We trust our vendors when they make recommendations on how to implement and run their software in our environments. We trust their recommendations to open ports on firewalls, add domains and IPs to allow lists. And this trust ultimately is what allows threat actors to bypass our perimeter security and gain full access to our networks by leveraging established and trusted relationships. So now that we have some knowledge on the state of software supply chains today, have a definition of what constitutes a software supply chain attack, and we know the tactics most commonly used and what makes them so successful, let's go ahead and put this into a visual. Emily, if you could go to the next slide, but only hit it once. Okay, so we're going to talk about a real life example, and I want to see if anyone can guess who we're talking about here. So in this example, a threat actor attributed to a Russian APT infiltrated a software vendor's network. They compromise the software's code by inserting malicious code into it, and then they successfully distribute it to numerous software customers as part of, you didn't even let me finish. Okay, so Mark already got it. It's an easy one, but I'll continue on and pretend that we're still trying to figure it out. So, not only did this APT actor succeed in inserting malicious code, but they also succeeded in signing this code. So this specific software update went out with digitally signed code, which success that access to the software vendor's development and or distribution pipelines were gained. So, so this is a pretty cool one because in this attack, they used two commonly used tactics, which was they hijacked updates and they undermined code signing. So you can go ahead and click the next one because we already got it. So this was Solarwinds. We can't talk about software supply chain attacks. If I had a piece of candy and you were here, I'd throw it at you for getting it correct, Mark. But so the Solarwinds attack, arguably the most successful and most impactful software supply chain attack in history. Hopefully it will be the biggest one in history. But honestly, the full extent of this attack is still yet to be known. There was an estimated 18,000 of Solarwinds, 300,000 customers worldwide that installed this compromised software. This included, FireEye, who ultimately were the ones who discovered the compromise in their own environment, various governments, US government entities, and as well as 18,000 other Solarwinds customers. So this example alone is a really good example of how effective a software chain attack can be. So it's pretty scary. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. Next slide, Emily. Okay, so software supply chain attacks by the number. So where does this leave us? According to INESA, which is the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, they're similar to CISA. They had a sponsored report that showed that software supply chain attacks are expected to increase by fourfold in Q4 of 2021. So some of the key findings, as you guys can see, the attacks focus, 66% of the attacks that they studied in this report focused on a supplier's code. 58% of the attacks were aimed at gaining access to data, which software supply chain attacks are different from another type of attack, ransomware. Ransomware is typically, its goal is destruction. So they just want to get in and break all your stuff and like ruin your day, your week, your month. With software supply chain attacks, they want to get into your organization and be there and learn your operations, get data, exfiltrate it. So they're focusing on getting in and essentially becoming part of your organization and just sitting there. So they, they want to access your data. 62% of these attacks exploited the trust of customers and their suppliers. And then they also relied on malware ultimately. So they leveraged, vulnerabilities and other things that you're running. So for example, in the Solarwinds attack, I think ultimately they were able to leverage vulnerabilities in other software in customers' environments to continue to execute once they were in. So long story short, old security frameworks, just reading a comment from Miguel. Yes, Ccleaner was one a few years ago that ultimately ended up being compromised as well, and that was a free product. I know that we had some people in the org that I worked at the time that liked to use it. They swore by it. They said, oh, anytime you deploy the Windows system, you have to clean the registry, and they would run Ccleaner on every single thing that they touched. But so that's no longer used. Obviously we don't use that here, but so older security frameworks used to defend against attacks are really no longer effective, and organizations must adapt. We have to find new ways to defend against them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things off to Lewis, and he's going to discuss ways that organizations can effectively analyze software as a means to get ahead of this increasingly dangerous form of cyber attacks.
Good morning, and thank you all. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for this opportunity to speak to you. I'm Lewis Allen. I'm an IT security specialist here at P&M Resources, and I'm going to speak to malware analysis, some key concepts, online resources and tools that are available, and how malware analysis fits into the stages of incident response, and hopefully provide some valuable suggestions along the way. So can we have first slide, please? Whoops, I didn't mean the first slide. Sorry, I meant the first slide. It's the one cyber incident response cycle.
You want me to go back to the beginning?
No, one more. Let's go forward one more. Oh yeah, so the malware analysis answers the question that posed there. So what's being shown is the cyber incident response cycle, and it's comprised of the stages of the incident response. We'll review quickly. I'm sure most of us are already familiar. We got preparation, identification, containment, recovery, eradication, and review. Lessons learned, or here, post-incident activity. The first three stages are significant because this is where the optimization can occur with minimizing the time to containment. So that's steps 1 to 3. Preparation is the most effective and beneficial stage in the cycle, where we review processes, confirm mitigations, procedures, and practice to reinforce procedures for the team, as well as identify improvements that can be made to the IR process and plans, all at a less hurried pace and without the stress and time constraints of an actual incident. The next step is identification. In the response cycle, it's shown as detection and analysis, which plays a role in actually throughout most of the cycle. And it's about recognizing a threat that may have been realized in the environment, collecting facts to that event, and analyzing it to assess whether or not this is an incident, firstly, then to assess impact, what type of threat it was or is, implications to the environment, and of course the containment status. In some cases, automated tools will have already taken care of that. And we document the information along the way so that we can speak to how the event got escalated into an incident, and so that we have facts for containment through eradication with identification of behaviors and attributes of that malware. The next slide, please. I guess I'll quickly go over stage 4, recovery is having addressed any disruption and damages the incident may have caused. Eradication is ensuring the complete removal of any artifacts and cause for the incident, and closing the loop on any temporary measures taken to facilitate containment or recovery. Systems are patched, the backups are whole, everything's working as normal. And then lastly is the review and lessons learned post-incident, where you look through the events that occurred, challenges that were faced, and how, decide and incorporate things into the incident response process that eliminate or help avoid those types of things happening again in the future. Now we're ready for this slide. So here's an example of how software analysis is going to fit into the preparation stage for an incident. The preparation stage can be about adapting to meet current challenges, adapting the incident response plans and processes. Today, a big challenge is the rising trend in both frequency and impact of malware incidents. They pose an elevated threat today, and as such, we're going to adapt our incident response to suit. This slide shows just a few of this year's Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency alerts and advisories that are associated with ransomware and distribution networks, supply chain attacks, and malware attacks performed as post-exploitation of enterprise product vulnerabilities. There's also that Spriter thrown in from CrowdStrike Intelligence to highlight an example of one of the supply chain attacks that Sarah mentioned in mainstream software development, library repositories, and the introduction of surprise bonus mystery functions to open source libraries. Next slide. So in order to address that increased threat, in preparation, we work with our controls, and one of those control types is administration controls. So hopefully a helpful suggestion is, if you don't already, employ a software approval process that includes the screening of software for malware before permitting the software into the environment. This brings the incoming software to security for review before it gets installed. And for like end user and developer requests, they're typically for common purposes, and it allows you to do things that save work and time. You can standardize on the solutions that are permitted, pre-screen those softwares, and put them into a repository for reuse with future requests. It lessens the vetting that's necessary and shrinks the profile of software to follow updates for. So we also include enterprise application software that comes into the environment as parts of projects and upgrades. We scan and screen those to increase the likelihood of catching any potential supply chain issue before it can become an incident. Lastly, because of the increased scanning, it increases the risk of, or the likelihood of seeing marginal verdicts as to whether or not software that's being assessed is truly malware or not. So it pays to practice using the tools, hone interpretation of the reports, and document things, at least for the go-to tools for your organization. And on to the next slide. And I missed my comment I wanted to make. That's the difference between chasing chickens and putting them in line. Putting them in line so that they come to you rather than chasing incidents. So with the detection or potential detection of malware, we're now moving on to the detection and analysis part of the cycle. And there are numerous online sandbox and IOC analysis resources that can be used to extend research to affirm an initial verdict from your go-to solution, the one we just documented in the preparation stage. And these tools are mostly free to us thanks to security and research communities and product vendors that are showcasing samples of their full services. Community tools often also enrich informational details with metadata concerning searches and queries that others are running and bring trends into view that can uncover mass campaigns or widespread issues as they develop. So the two tools, or the two types of tools that I bring up here, are Sandbox Tools, which automate, they're the new generation way of automating software analysis, from reverse engineering steps to extract potential indicators of compromise, artifacts, and comparison to a database of known bad for assessment. It offloads the analysts of the time and skill necessary to do the reverse engineering and saves time in doing the data collection. Sandbox also provides an isolated environment safe for executing samples for accounting the behaviors. And another benefit of online is there are multiple services with slightly different implementations of engines and methods for the data analysis, and different weightings on different indicators of compromise that are fished out of that sample. In a tough spot where the call is especially marginal and the software is maybe more critical to the environment, you can't just find another alternative that's already been vetted. The consensus across multiple sandboxes can be helpful in determining what that final call is going to be. The other type of service is the indicator of compromise search services that return informational and reputation data around the potential indicators that are provided by the researcher, things like file hashes, email addresses, web URLs, IP addresses, and internet domains. These can be useful not just in malware analysis, but for analysis and follow-up to other types of incidents as well. To provide these services, information is culled from several public and commercial sources: spam and internet blacklists, community and cyber intelligence sites, antivirus databases, and threat information sharing services, amongst others. These services are often useful for, as I said, investigating many types of incidents, not just malware, things like suspicious network traffic, links and phishing emails, and others. Next slide, please. So, software and analysis sandbox, what does it offer us? The sandbox's job is to determine how likely it is that a sample software specimen is malware and a confidence level for determining accuracy, as well as to report the criteria weighing most into a verdict that it makes. How does it work? The software sample is provided, the reverse engineering steps are taken, and the reverse engineer steps are taken in a virtual instance of a platform. The sample is copied over. The sandbox then performs static analysis with acquiring IOCs that are evident just from analysis or review of the files themselves. There's no execution involved, and attributes such as OS resources that are referenced, compilation artifacts, like whether or not the software has been packed, or what type of tool was used to pack it, the executable or the installation package, IPs, domains, and words that can be found in character strings that exist within the binary data sections. They're all evaluated with comparison to known malware families and TTPs. We'll talk to TTPs more in the next slide, but a lot of those come from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and they will be referenced by the Sandbox, well, and in most other threat research tools. Next, the Sandbox performs virtual or dynamic analysis in the virtual Sandbox environment to observe and account for behaviors and compare them to known TTP operations. Does the software attempt to communicate across the network? Where is it trying to communicate to? What is it trying to communicate? What protocols is it trying to use? Are there changes made to files, registry entries, account permissions, privileges, services, or scheduled tasks as the executable runs? What kinds of changes are they? Are they creating, deleting, modifying contents? Is it compressing or decompressing things? All of these can serve as signs for potential malware. So in the next slide, I'll talk to, next slide, please. So these most detection and analysis tools will refer to the MITRE attack framework, which we are still, I got my slides out of order, but that's okay. This slide is supposed to come after. Can you go one more forward, Emily? I think I got two reversed by mistake. Oh, this is, nope, I got one missed. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about the screenshot is just showing the MITRE attack framework, one of the elements. The MITRE attack framework is a knowledge base and model for tracking cyber threat actor activities. It's organized by adversary tactics, 14 currently. High-level objectives, goals, techniques, and procedures are assigned to each of those tactics, and along with their corresponding intent, examples, mitigations, and detections from the perspective of a cyber threat actor. The ATT and CK stands for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. It is the most commonly used tool for improving security posture, as well as the most cited reference model in the threat defense industry today. MITRE is a company, by the way, which also brought us CVE, and it's a company that is chartered to run in the public interest and runs the US, most US national cybersecurity research centers. Okay, so if we can go back a slide now, I'm ready to talk to your IOC search tools and for detection and analysis. So I've already used the term multiple times, indicators of compromise, but let me define it. IOCs are uniquely identifiable technical artifacts commonly used for the detection and identification of threats. So it's used in two different ways, actually, in practice. Though officially it will mention the artifacts related to a compromise or type of attack that has occurred. It can also mean more like a potential indicator of compromise, an item that you're going to research and look at the details and background of in order to determine whether it's an actual IOC or not. These are things like that, like file hashes and URLs that are inherent to the objects that are being analyzed. Indicators of attack will also be mentioned, and they're technical, uniquely identifiable technical artifacts like IOCs, but there's a malicious intent or attribution to an attack or a group that's inferred to that IOC. So with these different tools and others that are online, the data returned by the tools will vary by the type of potential IOC being searched. And we're going to look at some of the, at what some of the tools provide. So next slide, please. So Virustotal, which is probably the one that's closest, that is closest to what we are trying to do and emulate, provides the most comprehensive view from a analysis and hunting of malware perspective. Like other services, it offers sample evaluation and search functions for samples, information on related IOC types, files, hashes, and URLs identified in analyzing the software. What is unique about what Virustotal returns is that their extensive results across different IOC types, framed with a for evaluating software slant. The results offer a consensus reported with evaluation made by numerous multiple AV, antivirus and anti-malware products, and includes sandbox results, detections, details, behaviors, and community consensus on the threat being analyzed. Next slide, please. So now something happened to a few of my slides. All right, that's okay. So given what we've talked about with sandboxes and IOC searches and practice with our in-house tools and an increase in the number of scans that are occurring in our environment, the likelihood of running into a situation where your new enterprise application comes up as suspicious is likely to happen. It is not an uncommon thing. Legitimately or not, this is going to happen. And so it's going to take further analysis to determine whether or not that marginal or officially malicious call made by that tool is accurate or not. Doing this is going to take human judgment because Sandbox may be efficient at extracting the potential IOCs from a specimen file and comparing that to a database of known bad. But the tool cannot account for a sample file's intended purpose, nor the behaviors necessary for accomplishing the related tasks. The known bad behavior for an attribute is more likely to be bad until that context is accounted for. Another factor might be that potential IOCs are not always 100% uniquely identifiable. An example would be IP addresses can be shared across virtual websites. So they can be attributed to multiple websites where not all of them are the attacker, maybe just one or two of them. Also, IPs change over time. You can force that by closing down one virtual private server and just opening another one. They can also be hosted behind CDNs, and the same IP will relay traffic for many clients. And then lastly, another factor is that many legitimate behaviors can be ascribed to many illegitimate ascribed activities. Many legitimate behaviors can be ascribed with illegitimate like activity attributes. So the software is taking action like adding a registry entry. That valid software does that, as well as some of the indicators for malicious activity. And it's just because that's there in the list of potentials, doesn't mean that it's actually taking place. So let's see here. Sorry. Last, and then another factor to consider, this is the last one, variations in how the sandboxes work and in the analytics that are used in determining that verdict. Some observations may come up consistently that are invalid. One example is that certain types of files may raise suspicious behavior for rights to remote process. MSI installers will communicate with the installer, the Windows installer service via IPC, similar to a network channel. Some sandboxes capture that and do not report it, while others will see that as potentially suspicious behavior. Another one is you may get a finding for suspicious behavior for possible evasion technique contains cryptographic object references. If you look into the details for that, you may see that that is brought on by CA signed code that needs to be added to the trust repository for the operating system for the installation to complete. So in order to adjust for these, you look first at the results and the results summary for the key IOCs that weigh most heavily in the verdict and discount these factors. The expected behaviors given the program's intended purposes. If those are in there, you remove those attributes from the list. Low quality IOCs, look at how hard the IOC hits are. Search across other tools to see how definite the indications truly are. Review the details of the assessment to reveal suspect behaviors that can be accredited to activity legitimate to the software's intended purpose and the sandbox attributes. It's helpful to practice and review the reports done. It's helpful to practice in advance and review the reports and results for commonly mischaracterized behaviors and potential soft IOCs, and be familiar with those ahead of your incident. Lastly, verify file source and integrity. Make sure that the file hashes for the files that are under evaluation match up with what the vendor provided, and for validation of the package downloaded, and engage the vendor if you still haven't reached your final verdict. And that's all I have for malware analysis and IOC analysis tools. So back to
me. All right, Lewis and Sarah.
Sorry.
Thank you guys, and I appreciate your guys' time on this presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and just kind of go over some key highlights on both the supply chain and malicious and malformed presentation information that Lewis and Sarah just delivered. First, on the supply chain, I just want to kind of go over and just, some highlights around setting up defense mechanisms with the mindset that systems will be breached. This leads to better decision-making on technical controls for the environment, including design of the people, process, and technology to contain or mitigate an attack. People and internal processes are essential, including those of the supply chain vendors utilized by organizations. Vendors need to be vetted, including risk assessments and continuous monitoring of them for potential breaches that would lead to proactive measures that lead to protection of your infrastructure. These include resetting of credentials, accelerated investigations, and quicker containment of any incidents or detections within the environment. Ensure vulnerability mitigation is a responsibility of your suppliers and capabilities to immediately address 0 days as they occur. From the malicious and malformed side, proactively scan software before installing across your environment. Test and update your incident response procedures and validate that and make any adjustments as needed. Once, two or three, 4 times a year, whatever works for your cybersecurity teams, to ensure that they're adequately equipped to be able to respond to incidents and detections within the organization. Check data sources and detection tools such as firewalls, your SIM, AV, EDRs, IDS, and system logs for malicious events, and leverage open source intelligence OSINT to perform proactive mitigations and measures ahead of time to ensure that there isn't potential for a breach or compromise of systems. So that concludes our presentation for today. I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions.
Great. You can
Question
just,
that I have
go
a
ahead,
comment.
Jason.
Just wanted to say thanks for the presentation. I think it was very insightful, and it's good to know that you guys have a team that's constantly addressing and looking at all the fun stuff that P&M manages. So thank you for the effort of the team, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, and PNM
Thank
team,
you.
that's Jason Johnson with the Department of Information Technology.
Yeah, let me add that you guys did a really good job. Thanks for doing this session.
and
Thank
Nick,
you.
we just had a question in the chat. If you would share your contact information with Eli, he would like to reach out.
Yeah, definitely. We could do that. Do we want us to provide them to you? But I can assure that the names that we give you are actually our names, right? I'm just kidding.
Oh man, Mark Fidel would have really liked that one.
Candy to you, Nick. All right. Is this
Yeah,
anybody
definitely we
else?
could do that.
Thanks, Nick. Does anyone else have questions? What a great presentation. Perfect for our National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Thank you to the team at PNM, Nick, Sarah, and Lois. This was very informative, somewhat scary information, but great statistics. So thank you very much. And with that, on behalf of Deb, our Executive Director, and Emily, our Marketing and Events Manager, and myself, we look forward to seeing you at our next presentation. It looks like that would be at Experience IT. There's a full track for cyber, a whole 4 sessions. So hopefully you're registered and we'll be attending that as well as some of the other sessions. So we'll look forward to seeing you. Yes, Deborah?
I was just going to say, it looks like Eli put his hand up. He's like, please don't go yet. I have one more question.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Deb. I'm sorry, I missed that. Eli, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, I do have one last question for PNM. What unique threats do they face as a public utility in terms of external cyber threats? I know ATPs is probably one of them, but if they could perhaps give a little more specifics?
I can speak to that a little bit. So with control systems, it's like Internet of Things, like Arduinos and that type of thing, where you have firmware, and firmware is less, it's less flexible than software because it goes into the hardware. It's also more accessible, and there are tools that our engineers use in updating and facilitating maintenance on the controls that are very different from what typical end users use. And in vetting the software and fielding the alerts and triaging, threats that are specific to that, they're very different than what they are with typical end user and enterprise software solutions. That is a big challenge. Another one is the compliance aspect. There are a lot of rules which, on their face, they look like they're good cyber hygiene habits that are typical to security. But they have to be done on a basis that, that there's not a lot of room our latitude for reprioritizing things. And you have to be able to explain and provide proof to every aspect of the practice that you're following to implement that hygiene. Those are some that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Lewis. Did anyone else have any questions? Great. Okay, perfect. So thank you again for being with us today. And if you have a topic that you would like us to consider as we start to look at our 2022 calendar, our peer group will start to look at scheduling those, then please reach out and let us know. So great. Well, everyone have a great rest of your day. Do your part, hashtag be cyber smart. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Great job, P&M. We'll see you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.